minutes. So I'm going to get to my lesson. But it's really good to see you all. I love this series y'all are doing. I don't think I've ever seen a series like this. So this one has been kind of a challenge for me, to be honest. But it's one that I was really excited to jump on, a project that I was really excited to jump on. And the series of women in the Bible. And tonight we find ourselves in Exodus chapter 1 and 2. So if you have your Bible, go ahead and turn there. We're going to spend some time looking at these two chapters. And before we jump into them, I kind of want to frame these two chapters in a certain way. I have a lot of friends right now who are in Bible school. I took the 4-year college degree. A lot of my friends kept doing school because they're crazy. I don't know why they did that. But they're in school learning things like Hebrew and all kinds of stuff. And I've been talking to them a lot about different things in regards to the Bible. And one thing that is really interesting to me, talking to them about passages like the one we're talking about tonight, is the way they talk about how the Hebrew writers wrote the Bible. Because a couple of things, back then when the Bible was written, the Bible was not readily available to people, right? It was something that was transferred audibly, so people would go places to hear someone read the story of the Bible. But also they have this really creative way of making everything tie together in that context. And the way that what they would do is they would use repeated words and repeated phrases to build up association to things that have already happened. So for example, just to give a modern example, if I was to tell you I met someone today that wanted to grant me 3 wishes, right? I didn't tell you that I met a genie, but a lot of you probably heard the phrase, somebody wanting to grant me 3 wishes, and you immediately thought this person is like a genie, right? It's this association thing that's happening here. Now the reason I bring this up is because Exodus 1 and 2 is full of this repeated words and phrases to spark our imagination and to make us make associations with things that have already happened in the Bible. So now that I've said that, we're going to read a couple of passages in Exodus 1, and I want to see if we can pick up on some of the associations that are being made. All right? So first things first. See if we're on here. We'll see if we can get this to work. There we go. All right. So here's the first passage. Exodus chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. Again, see if you can pick up on any associations of words or anything that you've heard before in the Bible here. And so it says, Then Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation, but the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong so that the land was filled with them. All right, quick pause. Any association here? Does anybody recognize any of these words that just popped up in this passage? Okay, how about these ones? You have Israel being fruitful, multiplying, and filling the land. Has anybody heard this before in the Bible? All right, this is actually first page of the Bible. So if you look, Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, when God creates man, he says, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion. So this picture we get in Exodus right at the start is we get this idea that, I'm going to go back here. Okay, okay, we get this idea that the Israelites are living out the creation mandate, but something's missing from the creation mandate, right? Because in Genesis 1, verse 28, you have God saying, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, but then he says to subdue and have dominion over it, right? And this is not brought up in Exodus. But what's interesting is that it's because the Israelites are being subdued and ruled over. All right, so you have this idea and this framing immediately in Exodus where it's like, okay, things are going good, we're being fruitful, we're multiplying, we're filling the land, but there's a problem, and that is that the Israelites are in bondage in Egypt. All right, so with that in mind, let's look at verses 8 through 10 of chapter 1. It says, Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph, and he said to his people, Behold, The people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. All right, again, really quick, just a pause. Does any of this language sound familiar? Now, this is kind of a smaller thing, but I think that this is meant to bring us to this association. Notice the phrase here, come let us. In Hebrew, this is the exact same phrase that we see at the Tower of Babel whenever the people, whenever they say, come let us build this tower that goes into the heavens, right? Scholar Carmen Imes actually points to this whenever she's in a study of Exodus, and she says this. She says, Pharaoh repeats the arrogance of the brick makers in Genesis 11, who built a city and a tower to try to establish their own fame and avoid being scattered. Okay, but not only in Exodus 1 verses 8 through 10 does Pharaoh say, come let us, giving us this idea of this new Babel or this new Babylon, but also notice this word that comes after this, which is this word shrewdly. He wants to deal shrewdly with the people of Israel. Now, this is not an exact match, but it's very close to the same word that is describing the snake in the garden, right? Whenever it describes the snake in Genesis chapter 3, it says that the snake was cunning or wise, and it's a very similar word here to what Pharaoh is saying that he's going to deal with the people of Israel. Now, this by itself, for me, doesn't make the association, but whenever you look at what Pharaoh does next, which is he makes the work hard for the people of Israel, and he also does something that affects the fruit of the womb of the women. Right then, that's when the association comes into picture. That this is clearly the writer of Exodus making an association with the snake in the garden and saying that the power of the snake is now at work in this guy, Pharaoh. And so with all of this being said, I missed this quote here. This is scholar Tim Mackey from the Bible Project. I love the Bible Project. If you ever need a tool to study the Bible, I highly recommend. But he says this about Pharaoh. He says, Pharaoh is being set on analogy to the snake, also to Cain, who brings about death in the field, and also to Nimrod. So this is like all the major evil powers of Genesis 1 in one paragraph. The Hebrew writers are building this association to say all of these great evil powers in Genesis 1 are now at work through this guy named Pharaoh. And this is the setting that we find our story in tonight, is this snake of a character named Pharaoh working against the people of Israel, and we're wondering what exactly is going to happen. Notice verses 15 through 17. It says, Then the king over Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you serve as a midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live. It says, But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, Why have you done this, and let the male children live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, Because the women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong, all because the midwives feared God. He gave them family. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. So we have this framework in chapter 1 of Exodus, of this Pharaoh who is just the epitome of evil in the world. He is scared about this rising nation of Israel. He's scared because he thinks they're going to be a military power against him. And so he comes up with this plan, number one, to work them super hard, because if they're busy and if they're exhausted, maybe they can't rise up against him. But then even that's not enough. As they continue to spread, he decides to come up with this plan to kill all the Hebrew boys. Now, here's an interesting question for us tonight. Why is it just the Hebrew boys? Like, why does Pharaoh single out just the boys and not the girls? Now, for me, part of it is because you think about a military power. This is what Pharaoh is scared of, that they're going to rise up and become more powerful and join their enemies and fight against them. And so it seems like he thinks the only threat to him is the men. Like he's letting the women live because they're weak in comparison. Like they have no power in this story. But the irony of this story is that right when Pharaoh begins making this command in all of Egypt, it is the women who undermine him. Isn't it interesting that the story of Genesis begins with the snake undermining the woman, but Exodus begins with women undermining the snake? Specifically, these women in the first two chapters of Exodus. You have Shiphrah and Puah, the two midwives we just read about. You have Jocabed, who's our point of focus tonight. You have Moses' sister Miriam. You also have Pharaoh's daughter and her servant. And you also have Zipporah in chapter 3 and chapter 4 noted. But specifically in chapter 2, the shift in this whole story immediately goes to all the women that begin undermining the Pharaoh. And so this is the context that we find the story of Jocabed. Okay, now isn't it interesting that we're about to read a story about a woman giving birth in one of the worst circumstances that you could possibly think about. Like I hear people talk about today, like, I don't know if I want to have a kid in this crazy world that we live in right now where there is gluten and lactose and, all these terrible things, right? Whereas Jocabed is living in a time where boys are being persecuted. Now, one thing that's interesting about this story is in chapter 2, we actually don't get Jochebed's name. This is something that comes only in genealogies, specifically in Exodus chapter 6 and Numbers 26:59. I like the Numbers version better, so we're going to read that. It says this: the name of Amram's wife was Jochebed, the daughter of Levi, who was born to Levi in Egypt, and she bore to Amram, listen to this, Aaron and Moses and Miriam, their sister. Talk about a power family, right? Like you think about these three characters in the story of Exodus. You have Moses, who's the great prophet. You have Aaron, who's the high priest. And you have Miriam, the prophetess, right? Moses, the one who's going to lead the people through the sea. He's the one that goes up on Mount Sinai and talks to God and has conversations with him as a friend would have to somebody. You have Aaron, who is the mouthpiece for Moses in Egypt. And you have Miriam, who when the people go through the sea, she is the one that goes before them with dancing and celebration and singing in this huge celebration of the victory and the freedom they've just experienced out of Egypt. This is a power family. And it's kind of crazy to think about when you just see these names. Sometimes the most influential people in the world come from or are product of parents who don't get much attention at all, which is kind of like the story of Jocabed. But picking up in Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, says this: Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank. Okay, so question. How many of you does this passage seem just a little bit strange? Because this one has always kind of seemed strange to me. Because you look at the reasoning, Jochebed and her husband Amram have this child, and it says that she hid the child for 3 months, and the reasoning was because she saw that he was a fine child. Now, is that not just a little bit strange? I don't mean strange in the way that I'm sure that Jocabed thought that this was a fine child, but strange in the way that I don't think I've ever heard of any parent ever having a kid and then just being like, I don't know. It's okay, I guess. Like, I don't know if I actually want to keep this, you know? Like, no parent's ever done that. Like, me and my wife just had our first kid, and it was a beautiful experience. Like, the first time you see your baby. I don't think there's ever been a parent ever that's looked at their baby and been like, I don't know. So why in the world would this be the reasoning in chapter 2 for Miriam to hide this child? Again, this is where my Hebrew friends really helped me out a lot, because this is something that we don't really see in English. But this phrase that is in this passage in verse 2 is also an echo that's meant to build an association. Because the literal phrase here is the exact same phrase that we see in Genesis chapter 1. The wording here for fine child is actually just tov, which is the word good. And this could be, it's like it's copy and pasted from Genesis 1 when God looks at creation and he says, it is good. And so what seems to be happening here in Exodus 2 is that Jocabed she has this baby in a culture that is saying these baby boys are bad. They're evil. They are a threat to society. We need to get rid of them. And instead of joining in that cause, she in turn sides with Yahweh, sees life as Yahweh sees it. And because of that, in obedience to him, hides her child. Another interesting thing about this passage, this one is really cool to me. Any King James people out there probably already see this in the story, but if you have a more modern translation like mine, ESV, there's another association here. I told you, there's a lot of them. But you notice that she took for him a basket and made of bulrushes, and it says she daubed it with bitumen and pitch to waterproof it. The interesting thing about this is that the word basket here is the same word used in Genesis for ark. And if you have a King James Bible, it just says ark. But this is almost very clearly an association here of Jocabed saving Moses in a similar way that God saved Noah in the water with an ark. Continuing in the story, it says this. And his sister, this is Miriam, stood at a distance to know what would be done to Moses. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her young woman walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." One really interesting thing about this passage here, specifically, is just the question why Pharaoh's daughter came to the river to bathe. Like, I know that may seem like a small thing, and this is kind of a side note in and of itself. But if you look back through history, Egypt actually had running water. Which kind of begs the question, why in the world is Pharaoh's daughter coming to the river to bathe? Like, she has better options. So what in the world is she doing here? And also, there's this whole thing of what about her response to the baby? Like, why, if her father is Pharaoh, who has this mandate over all of Egypt to kill these babies, why is she responding to this Hebrew baby in this way? Now, I don't think I have the answer for this. I have a guess, okay? And that is, I think this is a ritualistic thing. If you just look at history, the Nile River was attributed to an Egyptian god that was the giver of life. And so bathing in it was something that people used to do in order to try and gain fertility. All right, so this might have been Pharaoh's daughter coming down to the river in order to attempt to have a baby, like not literally in that moment, but to become fertile so that she could have a baby. Now, again, that's just a guess. I don't know if that's true, but I thought it was an interesting side note. But it would explain why she responds the way she does to this baby. Because she's down at the river, the woman walked beside the river, and she sees the basket, and in it is a baby boy, and it's a Hebrew. And again, this is an undermining of the Pharaoh in this moment, because she, instead of deciding to obey Pharaoh and kill the baby, decides to keep it as her own. And then Moses' mom, we learn, gets promoted to like the coolest job ever, right? You see through verses 7 through 9, it says, "Then his sister Miriam said to Pharaoh's daughter, Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" This is such a smart move by Miriam, right? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother Jocabed. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. I mean, talk about a cool job. Like, you literally just get paid to do what you've wanted to do this whole time, just taking care of your baby. And also in the midst of your people group being slaves. You are getting paid to take care of your baby. Such a cool thing. Verse 10 says, "When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because she said, 'I drew him out of the water.'" All right, so this is pretty much all we get in the Bible about this woman named Jocabed. It's this one story right here. And so the question, I guess, that I want to just discuss for a moment, I'm running out of time, I've almost hit 30 minutes, so quickly, is this question: what are some things we can learn from this woman named Jocabed? And the first thing I think we can learn from this woman named Jocabed, I think this is more of a cool thing than like an application thing to our life, but I think this is really neat. Jochebed's life foreshadows what God will do through her children in this story. Because you notice, she is raising up the deliverer of the people of Israel, who is going to bring them through the water, to rescue them through the water. But first, Jochebed has to rescue her son, and the way that she does it, for one, it's from the water. She rescues him from the water because all the boys were supposed to be thrown into the Nile River. And instead she comes up with this brilliant plan to like kind of obey the Pharaoh. Like if you think about it, right? Like Pharaoh said, take all the Hebrew baby boys and throw them in the Nile River. And Jochebed actually does this. But she does it in a different way. And because of that, Moses is saved from the water. I guess one way you can think about it is Moses, the one who delivered the people through the waters, was first delivered from the water. And his mother doing this became the foreshadowing of what his life was going to look like. But secondly, the second thing I think we can learn from Jochebed tonight is we can all learn from Jochebed's faith. And the reason I say this is because this is what the Bible thinks we can learn from Jochebed. Because the only other time Jochebed pops up in the Bible is in the all-famous chapter of Hebrews 11. And she's actually one of only 3 women mentioned. She's kind of mentioned indirectly because both parents get credit, but she's definitely there because she's the focus of the story in Exodus chapter 2. This is what it says in Hebrews chapter 11. "By faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that he was beautiful. Again, that callback to Genesis 1. And they were not afraid of the king's edict. When you think about what Jocabed did, really what it boils down to is this is a story of courage. Because she was willing to put her life on the line to obey God, to undermine the Pharaoh who is abusing her people, and to deliver the person who is going to deliver the people of Israel. She is listed with a long list of people who also made courageous steps of faith for God. But for us, she is an inspiration to remind us that even though this world may say that certain things are good and certain things are bad, Yahweh's word still stands firm above all of it. And we as Christians are called to be the people, like Jocabed, who can look at certain things and say, it is good. And because of that, align our lives with God and choose to serve Him rather than all the powers that are very real, that are very present, and that are very felt in our world today. May we be people who are courageous just like Jocabed was courageous. Let's pray. God, we thank you so much for this time this evening where we can open your word, that we can learn stories like the story of Jocabed. God, I pray for courage like Jocabed. God, I pray that we can see the world as you see the world, that we can discern what is true in a world that feeds us so many lies. God, that we can focus on your presence in a world full of distractions. God, I pray that we can be representatives in this world of your name and your glory. God, that wherever we go and whatever we do, that we bring glory to your name. God, I thank you so much for this church, everything that it's meant to me. God, I pray that your will is done here in this church and in this town as it is in heaven. God, I pray that you give us what we need daily and that we trust you in your provision for every day and not worry about yesterday or tomorrow, but let those worries just keep to themselves. God, we praise you in all things. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.